Greetings from another rather sedentary episode of Stay In and Make Do. Now, I don't know about you, but since I've been home, I have done an awful lot of sitting down. We all know that sitting down for long periods isn't very good for us, but when you get really into doing something, it can be hard to remember. So today's project is going to be a sit tracker. You don't need no fancy Apple Watch to remind you when you need to stand up. You can just make your own. Again, all you're going to need is your Microbit and battery pack, a USB cable, and some way of attaching it to your leg. I found tape works just fine, as do tape-wrapped safety pins through these holes. Pin it to your clothes, preferably not your flesh. So, we're going to get straight into the coding. Head to makecode.microbit.org and let's get started. Now, where do we start? I'm going to drag an if-else block from the logic menu into my forever block. Now, this is because I want the Microbit to constantly check if I've been sat down too long and then do something. To carry out that check, the first thing we need to know is if I'm actually sat down. And one way of doing that is to look at the acceleration in the Z-axis. Now, this value is minus 1024 when the Microbit is perfectly flat and level with the LED screen facing upwards. And that just means the accelerometer is experiencing the full force of gravity in that direction. This number gets closer to 0 as we tilt the Microbit, and then it is positive 1024 when the LED screen is facing directly downwards. So, if we have the device strapped to our thigh, that number gives us a pretty good indication of whether we're sitting or standing. So let's drag one of these less than comparisons from the logic menu and clip that into our if block. And then take an acceleration from input and select Z from the drop-down menu. But what number to put here? You might be thinking we need something like minus 1000, but we've got to be careful. We don't want our sit tracker to only think we're sitting down when it is perfectly flat. Otherwise, every time we wriggle or cross our legs or something, it's going to think that we stood up and give us false praise. And nice as that would be right now, it kind of defeats the object. Through trial and error, I've discovered that minus 700 works pretty well for me, but legs may vary. You might find that you're particularly fidgety or something, so play around with it and find a number that's good for you. We'll add a sad face inside this if, just in case I need a further reminder that it's bad for me. And we'll add a tick in this else part so that it will give me proper praise when I'm stood up. Now we know we're sat down, the next check we need is how long for. So, let's drag another if block into the workspace and make sure we put it inside the first, because we only want to check how long we've been sat down for if we are actually sat down. It doesn't really make sense to check how long we've been sat down for when we're stood up. There are two things that are going to help us check the length of our sitting time. One of them lives here in input more, and it is the running time in milliseconds. The Microbit can't tell the actual time, but it can count pretty well, so it keeps track of how many milliseconds have elapsed since it was switched on, and this is what we can use to help us count a duration. But it's not quite enough on its own, so we also need a variable. I think of variables as buckets. They're like buckets with names. Buckets with names, and you can put information in the bucket and then have a look in the bucket later to see what's in there. And we can also change what's in the bucket if we want to. We're going to make a bucket, and into it we're going to put the time at which we start sitting down. And then the difference between the current running time and the time when we started sitting down, is going to be the duration that we've been sat down for. So go into the variables menu and hit make a variable. I'm going to call mine start time, but you can call yours anything that makes sense to you. Now, bear with me because I think this next bit is a little bit counterintuitive. We're going to set the start time while we're stood up. We're going to drag this set start time block under our tick, and we're also going to grab this running time from input and clip that in as well. Now the reason is this forever block is actually a loop. The program goes through this forever block and does each of the steps in turn, and once it gets to the end, it starts again. So the first thing it does is check whether you're sat down. If you are, then the program does the stuff inside this if part and ignores the else part and starts again. If you're not sitting down, the program does whatever is in this else section here, ignoring the stuff in the if above, and then starts again. So, setting the start time in the else section means that while you're stood up, the program is constantly looping through this else section and setting the start time to the current time. Then, the millisecond you sit down, this stops getting updated because now we're in this if part of the program and we're ignoring the else part. The start time is then frozen as the very last microsecond we were stood up. This is important because it means that you can stand up and sit down as many times as you like and your sit tracker will still work. While you're walking around, it will update that start time, but once you sit down, it will freeze it and use that value as the basis for the comparison into how long you've been sat. Speaking of which, let's write that comparison now. So, you're sat down, you know when you started sitting down. What are we going to put in this if here to check how long it's been since you started sitting? We need a block from math. Take this minus block and this comparison block here from logic, and we'll change that to a greater than. Clip it all together. Now, if the difference between two things is greater than a number, do something. Remember we said we were going to need the running time, the number of milliseconds since the microbit was switched on. Grab that from input and grab the variable you made and drop them in like so. The difference between essentially the current time and the time you started sitting is the duration you've been sitting down, and we're comparing it to our maximum sit duration. I'm just going to type 5,000 in here, which is 5 seconds in milliseconds. So it will be easy for me to test and see if it works. I'm not suggesting you need to get up every 5 seconds. That would be quite disruptive. But if you don't want to have to wait half an hour to find out your sit tracker doesn't work, then I would recommend 5,000 is a good starting point. And the very last thing we've got to do is pick something for the microbit to do when it figures out that we've been sitting for too long. I'm just going to go into loops, pick this repeat block, another show icon block with a cross, then a delay, and clear screen. And that's just going to make an X flash on the screen a few times to get your attention. But you can put whatever you like in here. Take a deep breath. Well done. That is your sit tracker finished. So the sit tracker works as it is, But there's one more block that I would recommend adding, especially if you plan on doing projects in other programming languages in the future. And it comes from this question. What happens if you start sitting down? You never get as far as this part of the loop, so you don't set the value as start time. So what's the program going to do? Luckily enough, the Microbit is quite clever, so it automatically sets start time to 0 when it fires up. And you can see this for yourself if you click on the JavaScript tab at the top. It's this line here. But other programming languages won't necessarily be so kind to you, and there might be occasions when you want the starting value to be something different. So it's a good habit to get into to do something like this. Set an initial value for the variable in this block here, onStart. OnStart runs once before the Microbit starts doing the stuff in the forever block over and over again. And the fancy name for this is initializing your variables. So remember, stay in, make do, and initialize your variables. Oh, and stand up. This is literally how I game. This is my actual, real, honest to God gaming face. No, not that one, I lied.